Everybody wants to send their kids to college.
Sure.
That we're going to send the best and the brightest to these institutions that have some of the least performant administrations. That seemed like the thing that was supposed to accelerate human civilization was now becoming a bottleneck on civilization. And that struck me as dangerous.
In this video, you're going to learn about Joshua Broggi, the CEO and founder of Woolf, an edtech company that has revolutionized how people around the world access higher education. Joshua's journey into tech is really interesting because his background isn't in tech at all. It's in academia. He was at Oxford, where he was a professor of philosophy, and he also was a member of Wolfson College, one of the premier research institutions in the entire world. You'll hear how Joshua saw an opportunity to modernize higher education through his time at Oxford, moving to Silicon Valley, where he founded Woolf, which sits at the intersection of higher education and technology. And stick around until the end, where we'll unpack Joshua's career playbook, a blueprint for becoming a stronger tech leader with lessons you can start applying right away. Let's jump into it. Tell me about your first job. From what I understand, it was a little bit off the traditional path as many of us in tech would have it. So tell us about it.
Well, I grew up in Vermont, so it was pretty rural, and there were a lot of animals. I think we had about 50 sheep and chickens and goats and, farmland to manage, fencing and things like that. So I don't know if it counts as a first job, but I was doing a lot of work as a kid. And, summers were spent in construction job sites and so on. So definitely instilled a value of hard labor. That's for sure. And it definitely was not technology. But my father, who was in construction at the time, ended up moving into tech and founding a tech company. And so I did spend a lot of time around computers and using, green screen, DOS and things like that.
When did you know that this was not the thing that you wanted for yourself?
I mean, I can remember being very, very tired and just thinking like how amazing it was that you could get paid while not having your body be in pain. You're like 60 and you've been carrying like sheetrock on your back all day or something. And, the idea of being very curious, being very intellectually motivated, which ultimately led me to, do a PhD in philosophy and teach philosophy at Oxford. I was much more intellectually hungry than I was physically satisfied with doing manual labor.
What did you major in college, Joshua?
Oh, I studied philosophy, studied religion. I was interested in all kinds of things. I was always studying things that I wasn't supposed to study. I'd go off-piste and be, like learning Sanskrit or something, even though it wasn't part of my official program. My interest in technology started relatively early. Like my father was in a silicon chip design firm that he started. And I can remember like the internet was coming out. Like early on you had to dial in and you'd like get 3 people at a university. And then like the web browser came out and like announced like we have 3 new web pages today. Like check out all the new websites on the internet this week. So it was just very natural to be playing around with those things in college. But I didn't start a company in my dorm room or anything like that. I was reading Sanskrit and reading philosophy and stuff.
And what did you do after college? Did you go right into the master's and PhD?
I worked a bit and traveled around the world. So I actually moved to China for a period of time and did a variety of other things. But mostly, continued, I finished up my 4-year degree in 3 years and threw in a master's degree in the 4th year and then traveled around and started a PhD. So, I was in my 20s when I started lecturing at the University of Edinburgh. So I ended up in Scotland and then moved from there to England. And at that point I was doing philosophy. So it was, very recondite, 19th century German idealism, things that are like pretty far outside of my current life as leading a small startup in technology.
What's 19th century German philosophy like?
It was a very rich and creative time when it came to higher education. And the University of Berlin, which later became the Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, got started at that time. It was kind of research driven, and you'd get kids just pulled out of remote Germany and dumped into these highly, enlightened institutions. And it was like an accelerant on human civilization. And that to me was incredibly fascinating, that you could have these institutions that kind of acted as, benders of the curve, or like huge engines of growth and really driving process forward. and that you could compress so much of human existence, like the difference between a Neanderthal and a modern human roughly getting distilled down to a few years of education through these institutions. So that struck me as really powerful and high leverage at a civilizational level.
There's so much to draw from there in terms of Woolf and what you're doing now, and how, at least my take is that Woolf is trying to democratize education and kind of recreate that by making education accessible to people all over the world. Let's talk a little bit about how you got there. So you're studying philosophy, you're lecturing on philosophy, you're teaching philosophy. What were the key moments that led to your career where you are now, which is founding Woolf, this higher education institution with thousands and thousands of students all over the world? And what kind of led to that? Anything specifically that you want to talk about?
I was on the governing parliament at the University of Oxford at the time, and I was very interested in creating a new college at Oxford, and was taking steps to do that. And just incredibly challenging. Like the bureaucracy of institutions is partially there to kind of create them. Institutions, the higher education institutions are not early adopters, and they're generally have a pretty low risk profile today. That was not true when many of them got started. They were kind of risky enterprises in the early days. We created these institutions that were very powerful in the early 1800s. They actually converted a huge percentage of the population into a higher education order, and then we did not update their bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy today is too kind of 1850s. And that is not where the world stands. But we've still made a collective decision as a civilization. This is like true in almost all countries around the world today. Like everybody wants to send their kids to college.
Sure.
That we're going to send the best and the brightest to these institutions that have some of the least performant administrations. On all kinds of metrics. And that seemed like the thing that was supposed to accelerate human civilization was now becoming a bottleneck on civilization. And that struck me as dangerous.
What are some other key moments that have helped shape where you are in your career today?
I'll give something very recent, which is in November, I began building software again. And so I built the first version of Woolf's administrative software. And my goodness, it was hard. And I had some help from a former student who was incredibly generous with his time. But it was just a drag to, fix like front end nav bars and, back end logic for step 1 and step 2 and, just grinding on for months. And, the liberation for one that can use an agent to build massive amounts of software, like vibe coding was true in maybe October of last year. Now you're talking about production ready stuff at scale with, real security baked in and so on. And so that has been really transformative, and the industry is changing very quickly, but there's this big gap between the folks that have firsthand experience now with the change, which anybody can do. You go out and you try using these tools, and it's incredible, what's possible. And it's very hard to grok what the impact of this is going to be. But, there used to be a very small elite group of scribes who had protected access to building real software, and those doors have blown wide open. And so the organizations that are aware of that are changing very quickly. And so I've done that. I built a bunch of stuff that was would have taken multiple years to build, and did it in 2 weekends. And now that is fundamentally changing how we operate as an organization. Like all the rules have changed for us internally as a company. And so that's been a very impactful change over the last 6 months.
What's changed? What are the rules and what changed?
On the engineering side, engineers have to be really comfortable with the fact that they're no longer going to be craft developers of beautiful algorithms themselves. And their job is not to write code. Their job is to manage agents that are writing code, or to even manage agents that are managing agents writing code. And so that's a really big mind shift. And, it can divide very good engineers in opinion. As a technology leader in the team, I'm looking for the opposite of resistance. I want to take in what are all of the potential, dangers here and process those. But at the end of the day, the bar for work has just gone up double, and then double again, and then double again. And if you're writing code by hand, it's just impossible to be successful in that environment. It's very, very hard. And so all of the engineering focus then has to be on what are the tooling, harnessing structures that we need to build around these agents to make sure that they are, performant and secure and so on. So the rules have changed a lot. And, I'm going through roughly all of the teams in our organization and looking at it from that lens.
One of the things that I know you mentioned to us in the past was the digital move, when you realized that you had to, find a way to get to Silicon Valley or the Bay Area in order to progress the tech side of Woolf. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I had this insight in, I'm sure others have had it in around 2013, where I realized you can move anywhere in the world. And the point was that the metadata for like where you live physically is digital. You show up to a birthday party and like everybody knows where to go and they know what the event is. And all of the information about that was on the internet, whether it was in messages or on some invite or something like this. And so I realized, well, that metadata is actually so important. You can just move anywhere digitally. And so like change like all of the groups you're in social media, change all the people you follow on the internet, go register as if you were going to show up. And then when you don't show up, say, hey, I wasn't able to make it. Can you send me the recording? Can you send me the notes? And you just act as if you have physically moved, even if you've not physically moved. And you can get just an enormous amount out of that. And there's this kind of mental shift when you change worlds of what it means to inhabit that new location. And I've, been an immigrant for much of my adult life. I've lived in Scotland, England, Germany, China, and, I understand the sort of mental shift that happens after a certain amount of time in a new culture where you adopt the language or you adopt the culture and it suddenly becomes the norm and the real horizon to you is that place. And you can do that digitally. And that's a very powerful open door to anybody in the world that wants to get access to something. And so at a certain point in Woolf's development, I realized I need to be in Silicon Valley in order to build this company the right way. And I couldn't move there that day, and I began the process of moving there digitally.
That's really cool, and such great advice for our listeners who are like, hey, how do I get connected with these people? Well, if you just kind of show up there digitally, you'll find your way to start making these connections. Let's talk a little bit about the founding of Woolf as a technology company. What do you think was the pivotal moment that led to that first round of funding? Like, was there a milestone you hit? Was it, you went in with just a killer pitch deck? Was it like, hey, we're going to change the world in education? Like, what did that look like?
So, I don't think I had an advisable path here. I reached out to probably 1,000 investors. And nobody took it seriously. And it was really only as we started to, grow the business. So first everyone said, you'll never be able to get, regulatory accreditation. And then they said, you'll never be able to get students. And then, so like every investor always had some reason. I don't think you can listen to the reasons and build for those reasons. You've got to build for your students or your customers or whoever. Ultimately, we partnered with First Round Capital and Todd Jackson, the partner there. They're just an incredible team that is focused on doing business in a high quality way. And they partner with founders very early. And so we were lucky to partner with them. We were pretty small at the time. We hadn't launched our API yet. And we had a few dozen students or something like this. So we were pretty early. Although we had been around a couple of years, the first couple of years, I basically spent wandering in the wilderness and trying to get, regulatory approvals.
We're going to keep it moving and move to our section called The Blueprint, where I'd love to hear your take on the handful of core principles that have kind of helped inform your career and, career choices and choices with the company.
I'm certainly somebody that values high agency and have exercised a lot of agency. And I have a couple observations about it. Like the first is I'm very lucky to have grown up in a high agency environment. So like my father moved to Vermont, on a whim with like no reason to go there and just like got a piece of land, and I grew up on that piece of land. My father did not like the local school system and literally invented a local school system and added a grade to it every year. My sister and I went up a grade. For 13 years, I went to this school, just pure agency and a side project on like running a real business. So extreme levels of agency are just normal to me. And, one of the things that happens when you exercise extreme agency is that things get very weird because you're out past the map. And you can be like kind of following the map, and the map makes the territory feel very safe. And as soon as you go off the map, the territory doesn't feel safe. You're just there and you have to make it work, and there's no map anymore. Like I had a map, I stayed professor at Oxford for the rest of my life. That was great. And so when you exercise agency, one, like you can do it. You can just go and do things, and like people will tell you that it's not possible, but like there's a very narrow path where you can make that world a reality. And so the pathway to starting a new university and having government approval in 50 countries for it is not obvious. And it takes just an immense amount of will. And at every barrier, you have to look at the barrier and just think, well, everybody says no, and I'm going to find a yes. I think it is important for entrepreneurs that are facing the challenge of building a business that they're just willing to go beyond the map and to keep saying yes and to finding a way to push ahead. And, there's this trade-off between the importance of quitting, where you have to have a return on your invested time, and the grit required to keep going. And so, if you're uncertain about whether it's really worth your life to push through for multiple years on a problem, it might not be worth it. But the amount of grit required is very high. And so that is the nut of the entrepreneurial problem is this a moment that requires more grit, or is this a moment that requires quitting and being really smart about pulling the plug on something? And that judgment call is just something that I think entrepreneurs have to face every day.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, make sure you like and subscribe to make sure the next one hits your feed. And if you missed our last episode, I have the link for you right here. In that episode, we talked to Aliona, who is the Chief Product Officer of Prisma Labs, which led the launch of the Lensa AI Magic Avatars. You'll definitely remember that from all of the avatars hitting your Instagram feed. Take a look, check it out. Really cool story to hear about Aliona.